So we finished the conversation on Tuesday talking about pulmonary ventilation, right? And I just want to remind you like a couple of things. So, in order to properly start the conversation about factors that influence the ventilation. First, what drives the ventilation is the pressure difference. If pressure, intrapulmonary pressure, is lower than atmospheric, we inhale. If it's higher than atmospheric, we exhale. Does that make sense? 2, lungs are elastic, and they are elastic pretty much in the same way as the balloon. So if there is no pressure inside them, they collapse. And that makes inhalation an active process. We have to work against the lung resistance to expansion. Makes sense, right? And exhalation is passive process. All we need to do is to let lungs to recoil, and they will expel the air themselves. With that in mind, let's take a look at what factors increase the pulmonary ventilation. First factor, of course, is airway resistance, like the resistance in blood flow. But this time, it's not blood, it's a gas. So friction is the main source of resistance. Okay? And the same equation can be applied, showing that flow of air is directly proportional to the pressure and inversely proportional to resistance. Does that make sense? Now, resistance to airflow normally, physiologically, in the state of physiological norm in health, is insignificant. There are 2 reasons for it. First, large diameter of airways. Okay, just large. Second, that is not here, but it's kind of obvious. Air has very low viscosity. If you think about it, it's a gas. Resistance to gas flow is low. Does that make sense? As we progressively move from large primary and secondary bronchi further down the bronchial tree into the bronchioles, despite the fact that the diameter of the bronchioles reduces, the overall, where I have it, yeah, the overall cross-sectional area, the total size of all bronchioles together becomes larger and larger, which, as you can see from this graph, dramatically reduces resistance in the airways. Yes.
So a large size reduces resistance.
Yes, but think about this. Basically, the question is, what has lower resistance? Look at me. One large primary bronchus or 100 small bronchioles? The answer is 100 small bronchioles, because when you add all the cross-sectional area of that 100 small bronchioles, it's going to be bigger than one bronchus. Does that make sense? So imagine you have one bronchus, one pipe, which is large. Make sense? Or you have 100 pipes, and each pipe is small. But if you put them all together, their collective diameter is much bigger than the diameter of that one single bronchus. So that means that those 100 pipes, because of that huge compositional cross-sectional area, will have smaller resistance than one large bronchus. Does that make sense? Now, in terminal bronchioles, resistance disappears altogether because gas starts to diffuse oxygen starts to diffuse through the walls of the terminal bronchioles. The only situation when airway resistance becomes an issue is obstruction of bronchioles, like in asthma. Okay, constriction of bronchioles will lead to elaborated breathing. Also, say if there is a mucus accumulating in the bronchioles, there will be a problem with ventilation. Second factor, surface tension. So, imagine that you have a water surface, okay, fluid surface that bounds the gas, okay. So water molecules try to stay attached to each other. They resist expansion. You can observe it when you blow a bubble, okay. When you blow a bubble, you need to add some soap, right, to make it bigger. But you cannot do a proper bubble when you just use water. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of the surface tension of water. When you try to blow a bubble and you expand the water molecules, move them away from each other, they immediately tend to go back, which leads to the collapse of the bubble. So fluid in the alveoli, the water basically, tends to resist to the expansion and tends to collapse alveoli. Does that make sense? Okay, we good? Now, can we reduce the surface tension? Yes, we add surfactant. So when you blow a soap bubble, you add soap, that's surfactant. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Another great example from day-to-day life of surfactants, unexpected surfactants, to give an idea, whipping cream. When you buy heavy whipping cream and you whip it, it becomes all fluffy and it stays fluffy. You're not going to do it with the regular milk. The reason why whipping cream can stay fluffy, because it has surfactant, fat. Okay? Same goes with egg whites. They're going to become fluffy because they have surfactant, protein. You see what I'm saying? You cannot do this with the regular water. You cannot make fluffy water. So surfactant in alveoli, of course, doesn't serve for cooking. It's a bunch of lipids and proteins that serve as detergent. This surfactant is produced by type 2 alveolar cells. And it reduces the surface tension, making alveoli easier to expand and less likely to collapse. Does that make sense? Sort of a very imperfect analogy here would be, the alveolus without a surfactant is the car tire. Alveolus with a surfactant is the balloon. Which one is easier to blow? The balloon, right? It's the same here. How do we know? We know what happens when surfactant is not produced in the necessary amounts. In babies that are born preterm, often surfactant is not produced in the amounts that are required. They develop so-called infant respiratory distress syndrome, meaning that after each breath, due to the absence of surfactant, the alveoli will collapse. Does that make sense? So these two factors, airway friction and surfactant, will be two most important factors affecting ventilation. The third one, that kind of a combined sort of factor, is the lung compliance. So this formula is the formula of the lung compliance, CL, where delta V stands for the change of the lung volume. And delta P stands for the change in transpulmonary pressure. I'm going to go back for a second. I'll be back. No worries. So this is the change of that's the transpulmonary pressure. Does that make sense? Now it changes here from -4 at the beginning of inspiration. It's -6 at the end. Does that make sense? Do you see that change? So the change actually is 2 millimeters of mercury, right? From -4 to -6. So lung compliance basically tells you how much air, volume-wise, you're going to inhale at the given change of transpulmonary pressure. The higher the lung compliance, the easier it is to expand the lungs. The more air will get in your lungs at the given act of inhalation. Do you follow me? The main problem with high lung compliance is that lungs are very easy to expand, but not so easy to recoil. So exhalation becomes a bit of a problem. Usually we don't face high lung compliance. We're usually concerned about low one. So what can reduce lung compliance? Look at this. So this is transpulmonary pressure. And you can see that increase in the transpulmonary pressure in case of decreased lung compliance leads to the much smaller lung volume and therefore much smaller volume of inhaled air compared to the normal compliance. Anything that reduces the elasticity of the thorax, okay, first of all, ossification of the costal cartilage, problems with the muscles of inhalation like intercostals, okay, reduced surfactant production will affect it as well, damage to the lung tissue itself, fibrosis. Think for a second, imagine lungs in the pleural cavity. Can you imagine them? The cavity, so lungs are covered with visceral pleura, cavity is covered with parietal pleura. Imagine that somebody develops infectious pleuritis, infection and inflammation of the pleura. You with me so far? When pleura heals, what's formed, what it heals with is the scar tissue. The scar tissue is not expandable, so lungs cannot properly expand as they used to. Lung compliance is reduced. Does that make sense? You see? Now, sort of practical applications. In elderly, what you're going to see more in elderly, ossification of the costal cartilage. Right here, I don't have a skeleton here, but this cartilage here decreases the compliance because they can't distend the lungs, and that increases the chances for infection. And another problem, people with kyphosis, with a hunched posture, okay? Lung compliance is decreased as well. Does that make sense? Moving on. So, on this image, I decided to skip all the text. So, it's fairly simple. You need to know the volumes and capacities of the lung, and we're going to review that now. And volumes are particularly simple. We're going to start with a normal volume that you inhale and exhale every time. This is called a tidal volume. So right now, as you're breathing, you breathe in and breathe out a tidal volume. You don't need to know any numbers. Am I clear? Now, my question for you if I will ask you, can you inhale more than your tidal volume? What your answer is? Yes. That extra amount of air that you can get in your lungs on top of tidal inhalation is called inspiratory reserve volume. How much more air you can get on top of your normal tidal inhalation. Now, if I ask you, you're breathing normally, can you completely, can you exhale even after your normal breath? Yeah. So that amount of air that you can get out of your lungs after normal tidal exhalation is called expiratory reserve volume. Does that make sense? Now, there is always some air left in your lungs. Before we move to the name, why? Yeah, because they have to stay inflated, exactly. So there is some air, so lungs do not collapse completely. Does that make sense? This is called residual volume. So those are 4 lung volumes that you must know. Now what about capacities? A few of them are really simple. First is total lung capacity. I don't think I need to explain what it is. Right? Total lung capacity. That's the total volume of your lung. Clear? Next one, vital capacity. That's your inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, and tidal volume. Basically, this is the amount of air that you can manipulate. Does that make sense? You can actually measure it using spirometer. You can inhale to the top of your lungs and then exhale as much as you can. So that will be your vital capacity. Make sense? We have inspiratory capacity, which is tidal volume plus IRV. Does that make sense? Tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve. That's the inspiratory capacity. Right here. And then we have functional residual capacity, which measures the amount of air that is left in your lungs after normal exhalation. So I will ask you about the volumes and the capacities. For volumes, it's basically matching the name, the description with the name of the term. For capacities, I may give you something like, what is vital capacity? I'll give you several options. This plus this plus this. That plus that plus that. Does that make sense? You have to match it. Now, there are some really cool things that I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about the dead space. Something that we rarely think of, but we do have some dead space in the respiratory system. Think about this. When you take inhalation, does all air that you inhale goes in your lungs? No, no, no. Because some air will stay in the conducting zone, right? Say I take this inhalation here. I have air in my throat, in my trachea, larynx, bronchi. That's all not really any functional quote-unquote air. Does that make sense? It does not reach alveoli. So this part of gas that remains in the passageways is called anatomical dead space. In addition to anatomical dead space. We also have alveolar dead space. So in alveolar dead space means, say, somebody has an emphysema and certain percent of the lung is completely dysfunctional. Those dysfunctional alveoli represent alveolar dead space. I mean, that's it. Does that make sense? You understand what alveolar dead space is? Volume of the lung that is not suitable for gas exchange. So total dead space is the sum of this. Anatomical plus alveolar. Does that make sense? Now, let me ask you just this. So, say you inhale. I just pick the numbers from the ceiling, okay? You inhale 2,000 milliliters, okay, of air. Your anatomical dead space is 150. Your alveolar dead space, I'm sorry, 150. So 150 dead, anatomical, 150 alveolar. You inhale 2,000. How much air will be actually available for the gas exchange? 1,700. You see, like, math-wise, you don't need to calculate this. I will tell you what you will need to calculate. Okay? Not this. But you need to understand the concept. Clear? Now, we measure respiratory parameters with a spirometer. The reason why we do that, we differentiate between the obstructive and restrictive pulmonary diseases. We're going to be talking about it later, but I'm going to give you like a general idea what's the difference. So, obstructive disease is the one when the resistance of airways is increased. Does that make sense? Now, when resistance of the airways is increased, it means that the air, you blow through this smaller tube. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? So, when you inhale less because the air, you still have normally functional lungs. So, your total lung capacity is the same. Does that make sense? You just cannot get the same flow per given time. You see what I'm saying?
So is that like breathing through a straw?
Sure. Yep, that'll work. Breathing through a straw. When you have asthma, asthma is obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay? Now, in restrictive disease, your lungs can't inflate because there is some damage to the pleura. So the lung volume physically decreases. You see what I'm trying to say? You breathe normally, like your rate of breathing is normal, but you cannot expand them that much. You see the difference between obstructive and restrictive? So let me explain what we're looking at. Here's the deal. So for instance, there are some measures that can be measured using spirometer. I'm not going to talk about capacities that much. I want to talk about this. Imagine somebody has an obstructive disease. Okay? Meaning that somebody is breathing through a straw, quote unquote. Are you with me? So you can measure forced expiratory flow. Somebody exhales like this. And you measure how much air goes in the middle of that expiration. If you're breathing through a straw, the volume of that air will be lower than normal. Does that make sense? Because your airways are obstructed. Another way to say it is, if I have asthma, okay, can I still fill my lungs all the way up? Yes, it'll take me more time, right? my one maximum breath will be longer because I have to get them through the narrow passage. You see what I'm saying? And same way, my exhalation, complete exhalation, say forced vital capacity, meaning from top of my breath to the complete bottom, will take longer. Does that make sense? This is how COPD can be diagnosed. Okay? So, parameters like forced expiratory volume, forced expiratory flow, maximum voluntary ventilation, they will be significantly decreased in patients with obstructive disease because they can't exhale or inhale as fast as healthy people. You see what I'm saying? Do you understand that? Now, volumes like, residual volume or vital capacity or total lung capacity, these will be decreased in the people with restrictive disease, say fibrosis or obesity, because it takes up the volume. People cannot expand their chest. Does that make sense to you? So that comparison, basically, what the measurements in that particular person versus normal will tell you what kind of lung disease this person is. Now, this, you will need to calculate this. The word of warning, you are allowed to use the calculator, and you will need actually a calculator, unless you're really, really good with doing it on a paper. Okay. So, what is minute ventilation? Okay. Now, I didn't read it well. It's not minute, minute ventilation. Minute. It's the amount of air that goes through the respiratory tract in a minute. Does that make sense? So say if my tidal volume is 500 mils and my breathing rate is 20 breaths per minute, what's my minute ventilation? 10,000? Yeah, 10,000, right, yeah. 10,000 mils. Does that make sense? We multiply half a liter by 20. There you go. Makes sense, right? Now, that does not correspond to the amount of air that actually reaches alveoli. Does that make sense here? Because some of that air goes into the dead space. And here comes alveolar ventilation rate. That's the amount, volume of gas that actually reaches alveoli in a minute. Are you with me? So how you calculate it? Total tidal volume minus dead space gives you the amount of air that reaches alveoli with each breath. You multiply it by the number of breaths per minute, you get alveolar ventilation rate. Let me show you an example. Look at the table at the bottom. Let's talk about normal rate. So rate is 20 breaths per minute. Tidal volume is 500. Dead space is 150. So if tidal volume is 500 and dead space is 150, how much air reaches alveoli with each breath? 350. You multiply it by 20, alveolar ventilation rate is going to be 7 liters. Does that make sense? Now let's see what happens when you start to breathe very rapidly, but your breathing is pretty shallow. So tidal volume becomes 250, Dead space doesn't change. And respiratory rate increases 2 times compared to normal, from 20 to 40. So if tidal volume is 250 and your dead space is still 150, how much air reaches alveoli with each breath? 100 multiplied by 40, you will get 4 liters. So your shallow breathing will actually decrease the pulmonary ventilation. Does that make sense? The alveolar ventilation rate. On the opposite, slow and deep breathing will deliver much more. Here's the example. Tidal volume is 1000. Less your dead space, still 150, doesn't change. Respiratory rate drops to 10. 1000 minus 150 gives you 850. You multiply it by 10, you get 8.5 liters a minute, more than your normal ventilation. So this is something that you will need to calculate. I will not provide you with the formula. Just come on, it's simple. So you need to know that, minute ventilation is tidal volume by number of breaths, and alveolar ventilation rate is tidal volume minus dead space multiplied by number of breaths per minute. Practical application. I'm going to be talking about my favorite pastime, running. So when you jog, you often, jog. I'm not talking about sprinting, like jogging. Your respiratory rate often increases, but you cannot take deep breaths because it's much faster. It's kind of counterintuitive, but if you control your breathing, it will be much easier to jog if you take slow, deep breaths while you're running. But you have to watch, okay? Since there's conscious component in the control of respiration, it's actually an advice when you jog, watch your breathing pattern and make sure like you breathe at every 3 or 4 steps. So extend inhalation, extend exhalation. Your pulmonary ventilation will be much better. That makes sense? Sorry. Which brings us to the non-respiratory air movements. Honestly, I know everybody's concerned about exam. You have to guess what I'm talking about by description. Is that sneezing or coughing or yawning? I think you can do it. I'm not going to be too tricky about it. No, just, a couple of interesting things. So cough and sneeze are practically the same. They respond to irritation. Okay. The difference is that in coughing, your mouth is open, your uvula is elevated, so when you cough, air goes out mainly through the mouth. When you sneeze, uvula is depressed, it closes the oral cavity, okay, mainly. Sorry, oral cavity is closed and you mainly release the air through the nose, okay. Fun fact, you know how sometimes, we try to block sneezing by closing our nose and letting it kind of hit the closed respiratory passage? Can it be damaging? Yes. There was an example. A person actually ruptured pharynx by extreme pressure by sneezing like this. Actual rupture. Okay. Crying. Crying and laughing are the same. Seriously, like mechanistically, it's the same. Both emotionally induced. Crying, so 2 things. First, well, nobody knows why we laugh. The evolutionary importance of it. We know why we cry, when we're exposed to chemicals. It's a protective response. we don't know what is the evolutionary importance of emotional crying. Seriously, like no idea. We don't know why people need to cry when they're sad. Don't know. Hiccups. Never mind. So hiccups, yeah, so most likely it's the irritation of the phrenic nerve. Okay? So some kind of irritant irritates the phrenic nerve, initiates the action potentials that stimulate diaphragm, and it, short contraction, spasms of the diaphragm, right? What causes hiccups? Well, nobody knows. I can share my own experience. I hiccup when I eat something super spicy, extremely spicy. That makes perfect sense because you have phrenic nerve runs pretty close to esophagus, and that burning sensation can trigger like weird action potentials, and you get the diaphragm experience. Or it can be, I don't know, maybe it's interaction with some chemoreceptors in the stomach. How can you cure hiccuping? We can't. There's no real trial, no drug, there's no method to cure hiccuping. There are some drugs that doctors sometimes prescribe to limit it, but nobody did any clinical study. I believe the longest hiccup bout in a person was more more than 60 years. The person was hiccuping for like 60 plus years, including night, yes. And actually suddenly just stopped 1 year before dying. Just kind of, makes you think maybe death was partially inflicted. He just couldn't bear it anymore. Yawning. The mechanism that triggers yawning is unknown. Nobody knows why if one person yawns, everybody else yawns. As a person who used public transportation a lot, as a student and later, when you ride the very early morning bus or subway train, everybody's sitting there and fairly empty. One person yawns and it's hilarious because the entire bus or entire train, like a domino effect, everybody starts to yawn. It's an inspiration which has very deep ventilation effect. Does that make sense? So basically all alveoli are ventilated. Okay? Again, there's going to be matching the description with the air movement. Which brings us to the story about external and internal respiration. And we're going to talk about some physics. So first let's define what's the difference between external and internal respiration. So external respiration refers to the gas exchange between alveoli and blood. And internal respiration refers to the gas exchange between the blood and the body tissues. Am I clear? Can you imagine that? So, what happens in your lungs is external respiration. What happens in your tissues is internal. What can be confusing here? External respiration is not breathing. Is that understood? What we call breathing, scientific name for that is pulmonary ventilation. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, two laws drive the gas exchange, both in tissues and in the lungs. One is called a Dalton's law. Dalton's law states that total pressure of gas mixture is equivalent to a sum of the partial pressure of components. So if you look at the first two columns of the table at the bottom, you will see that first of all, the partial pressure of each gas is proportional to the gas concentration in the mixture. Does that make sense? So basically what I'm trying to tell you, if you will take partial pressure of nitrogen and divide it by the partial pressure of oxygen, you will get the same result as if you take percentages and divide them in the same way. Does that make sense? Now, as you change the concentration of gases, partial pressure of gases also changes. Henry's law describes the behavior of gases in contact with water, and it postulates that concentration of gas in the water is proportional to the gas partial pressure over the water. Now this has really important implication for us. Imagine that you have a beaker with water that stands here at the desk. Now, the concentration of CO2 in that water is proportional to the concentration of CO2 in the air. Does that make sense? And they are in the equilibrium, meaning that there is no net movement of CO2 here and there. We clear? Imagine now that you buy a carbonated beverage and you open it. What do you hear? Hissing, right? That's carbon dioxide leaving the can or a bottle. Why? Because the beverage is carbonated. The beverage is saturated with CO2. So the concentration, the pressure of CO2 inside the beverage is much higher than the pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere. You see what I'm saying? When you open the beverage, CO2 starts to leave the beverage, the liquid phase, going into the air until the concentrations are equalized. Does that make sense? Am I clear? Why we are concerned about this? Two main reasons. We need to know what is the pressure of each gas in the lungs, blood, and tissues, because the movement of the gases will be guided by the pressure differences. Am I clear? Basically, for the most part of discussion about the actual respiration, we need to remember gases always go from higher pressure to the lower pressure. Am I clear? Lastly, solubility. Gases are differently soluble in water. Oxygen and nitrogen, for instance, are very poorly soluble. Carbon dioxide, 20 times better than oxygen. That makes sense? That will contribute, by the way, to the movement of gases to some extent as well. Are you with me so far? Do you follow me? The last thing to know before we start talking, the higher the temperature, the less the solubility, and vice versa. So this is why you can, technically can test it. If you take, say, Coke, okay, and you take 2 bottles, open one at the room temperature and leave it at the room temperature, open another, stick it in the fridge, let it sit there, the one in the fridge will retain more CO2 because it's colder and CO2 will be better dissolved. Does that make sense? Now, here's an interesting thing. Now, this picture on the right shows you the Dalton's law. You have pressure of oxygen, pressure of nitrogen, and the air pressure is these two put together. So I want to compare, before we move on, I want to compare the composition of the alveolar gas and the air. You see percentages in the air. Let's focus on percentages, not on the pressures. We'll get to the pressures eventually. So about 79 nitrogen, about 21 oxygen, a little bit of water, a little bit of carbon dioxide. I want to be honest with you. There are some other gases in the atmosphere. I took them away and added those numbers to CO2 to simplify the math. Okay? Now look what happens in alveoli. Which two gases have higher concentration? These have lower. You see, the percentage is lower. You see what I'm saying? They have lower concentration in alveoli. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? CO2 and water have higher concentration in alveoli. Why? Julie said it last time. Why do we have higher concentration of CO2 in alveoli? It's like on the surface. Because there's a gas exchange. And those Julia's words. Like, there's gas exchange. Yeah. So, CO2 comes out of the blood. And there's water. And actually, if you think about it, all our cells, except few, they respire. Cellular respiration yields carbon dioxide and water. And this is what we exhale. Does that make sense? Now, since concentration of CO2 and water in the lungs, in the alveoli goes up, it cannot go over 100%. So concentration of nitrogen and oxygen has got to go down. What it does. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I was kind of confused because you said that the percentage is smaller for the nitrogen and oxygen.
Yes.
Obviously, on the table, they're big numbers. So I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, that you just take those big numbers and you subtract them from 100, and that's what you get. Like, those are smaller numbers in comparison to where the water and carbon dioxide, those are small numbers actually on the table.
Yes. Yes. So carbon dioxide, when we compare carbon dioxide in the lungs to carbon dioxide in the air. So carbon dioxide in the lungs is 6.2%. Carbon dioxide in the air, 5.2%. Carbon dioxide in the air is 0.1. Does that make sense? This is what I mean by higher. Not that CO2 is higher than oxygen. Now I understand where this confusion came from. Not that it's higher than oxygen. No. Compared to the atmospheric air. Right? Sorry about that. I didn't realize. Okay? We good? Understood? So this is basically a summary of respiration. So let's chat about lungs first. And pay attention to the bars and the numbers. Again, the disclaimer. I try to avoid the numbers by all means. Because I don't want the trees to take your attention away from the forest. No, maybe some people, ask to memorize the pressures. I don't. Maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I think if you will work in the respiratory therapy or respiratory care, you'll learn those numbers inevitably, okay? And with me, like, we're done with this, you forget it. So let's see what happens in alveoli. So in alveoli, you have exchange between the air and the blood. Does that make sense? Air, which is alveoli, and the blood, which is pulmonary capillaries. So what is the pressure of oxygen in the alveoli? 104. What is the pressure or concentration of oxygen in the blood? 40. So if blood pressure is lower than alveolar, where would oxygen go? Come on, say it. Towards the blood. Yes, in the blood. There's going to be no hard questions here. It's absolutely on the surface. Okay, so oxygen goes in the blood. Now, CO2. CO2 in alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury. CO2 in the blood, 45. CO2, where does it go? Towards alveoli. Yes, from blood to alveoli. Does that make sense? Now, you see that the pressure gradient for oxygen is much steeper, right? 104 over 40 versus 45 over 40. You see what I'm saying? Now, does that mean that gas exchange runs at a different rate? Turns out, no. The thing is, oxygen is much less soluble than CO2. Does that make sense? So by that steep gradient, you basically force oxygen to go into the blood. CO2 does not require a steep gradient to move from blood to alveoli and vice versa. Am I clear? Because it's much more soluble. Another thing about gas exchange in the lungs, look at the graph here at the right bottom corner. So this is the time, 0.25 seconds, that is required for oxygen to basically equilibrate itself between alveoli and the blood, to go from alveoli to blood. Does that make sense? Now that is the time that blood spends in the pulmonary capillary. So you see, exchange occurs in a fraction of a time that blood spends in the lungs. Do you understand that? So in the first 0.25 seconds, everything's done. Why is it important? When your respiratory rate increases and your cardiac output increases and blood flow increases, this time, 0.75, the time that blood stays in the pulmonary capillaries, this time will shorten. You with me? But it will shorten just to this, so there still be enough time for the gas exchange. Now let's see what happens in tissues. In tissues, the concentration of oxygen in the blood is 100. Concentration of oxygen in the tissues, 40 or less. So in the tissues, blood will go where? To the tissues. And not the blood, oxygen will go into the tissues. And in terms of CO2, concentration of CO2 in the blood is 40. Concentration of CO2 in the tissues is 45. CO2 will go where? To the blood. Now, I told you that you don't need to know the numbers. You have to be able to answer a question like this. What happens in the tissues? In terms of gas exchange, oxygen goes from blood to tissues, CO2 from tissues to blood. Am I clear? And then, what about pressure relationships? Pressure of oxygen in the blood is higher than in the tissues. Does that make sense? Pressure of oxygen in the alveoli in the pulmonary capillaries. Pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is higher than the pressure of oxygen in the blood, in the lung, in the pulmonary capillaries. So statements like this, only relationships, no numbers, direction of flow, and relationships of pressure. Does that make sense? Good? Cool? Now, this is something that we kind of talked about. It's called ventilation perfusion coupling. So there are two processes that happen in the alveoli. One is called perfusion, another called ventilation. Perfusion is how much blood reaches the alveoli, and ventilation is how much air gets in the alveoli. Does that make sense? And then there is a statement, concept. Perfusion and ventilation are matching each other. What does that mean? So, perfusion responds to changes in oxygen pressure in the alveoli. Imagine that you have two alveoli. One that has a lot of air. And you see that in the bottom right. And one that has little air. Blood flow to which alveolus will be higher? More air. Does that make sense? Because you want more blood to go to alveolus with higher concentration of oxygen to pick up more oxygen. So blood vessels, now, blood vessels that run to the alveolus with a higher oxygen concentration will do what? Dilate or constrict? Blood vessels that go to the alveolus with a higher concentration of oxygen will dilate, lower concentration of oxygen, constrict. Now, think about what is the function of the blood in the alveoli. That's simple question, surface question. Exchange and pick up what? Oxygen. Very good. So that's kind of a main issue, right? Pick up oxygen. This is why more blood goes to oxygen-rich alveoli. We good? Now, what about ventilation? Ventilation regulates the diameter of bronchioles. Now, what is the function of the lungs in terms of CO2? What do lungs do with CO2? Expel it. So, if you have an alveolus with a bigger concentration of CO2, you following me? You want to expel it faster. Does that make sense? How can you expel it faster? Open up the bronchioles. You see? So bronchioles that lead to alveoli with a higher concentration of CO2 will expand. Let's talk this over one more time. You have an alveolus, and concentration of oxygen in that alveolus for some reason goes up. How does it change perfusion? Oxygen concentration in the alveolus goes up, increases. How does it change it? It will increase perfusion. Increased perfusion means vasodilation or vasoconstriction. Vasodilation. Now, simple, but a bit of a, not tricky question really, but to check your understanding of the gas relationships. If oxygen concentration in the alveolus increases, how does it affect the concentration of CO2 in that same alveolus? Huh? Decreases, exactly. And if CO2 concentration in the alveolus decreases, what happens to bronchioles? They constrict. Since they constrict, ventilation decreases, oxygen concentration goes down, both because blood picks it up and ventilation decreases, and the balance is returned. Does that make sense? So if you think about it in dynamic, you have two conducting systems. One is pulmonary capillaries, another are bronchioles. Are you with me? So they aren't like pipes, solid pipes. They constantly dilate and constrict, matching the ventilation and perfusion. You see what I'm trying to say? They change their diameter a little bit, but they do. Clear? Good. So yes, I'm going to be asking you questions about this. Something like, if the concentration of oxygen in the alveoli goes up, what happens? And boom, 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 you have versions you have to pick one. Okay? Before we talk about the transport of oxygen, I want to tell you something. It was a bit of a struggle for me when I studied physiology myself. We often want something to be logical. I mean, something that we want the answer to the question why. You see what I'm saying? Why we have two legs? Why, I don't know, the polar bear is white? Sometimes we can give the answer to that question, but most of the times in biology, we cannot give the answer to why question. And this is an example. So we're going to be talking about transport of oxygen, and turns out that vast majority of oxygen is transported by hemoglobin. Only about 1.5% is directly dissolved in plasma. The rest of it is bound to the iron in hemoglobin. We good so far? Am I clear here? Now, there are 4 irons in the hemoglobin, meaning 4 oxygens. Is that clear? Now, oxyhemoglobin is formed in the lungs, deoxyhemoglobin formed in the tissues. So, let me ask you this. Arterial blood, systemic arterial blood, blood that, goes from, say, aorta into the, superior mesenteric artery. Arterial blood, does it contain mainly oxyhemoglobin or deoxyhemoglobin? Oxy. And the venous blood contains deoxy. Does that make sense? Now, look at the picture and tell me how many molecules of oxygen can bind to a molecule of hemoglobin. 4. Can it be 3? Yeah. 2, 1, 5. No. So, the percentage, the number of molecules that are bound to hemoglobin, oxygen molecules that are bound to hemoglobin, is called hemoglobin saturation. So if we have 2 molecules bound to a molecule of hemoglobin, what's the saturation? Percent. 50. So one molecule can be 0, 25, 50, 75, 100%. Does that make sense? But since we're talking about, quadrillion molecules, since there's so many of them, we have this continuous saturation. When you go to the doctor and they put the little clip on your finger and they measure the oxygen saturation, your blood, this is what they measure. They measure percentage among all hemoglobin molecules. What's the percentage of saturation? We clear? Now, loading and unloading, oh, that's the term. When hemoglobin binds oxygen, this is called loading, like we load the truck. When oxygen jumps off hemoglobin molecule in the tissues, we call it unloading. So far, we clear? So loading is binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. Loading and unloading follows cooperative binding. And I'm going to exemplify it using loading. First molecule of hemoglobin binds somewhat hard. Second one binds easier. Third one binds even easier. And the fourth one binds absolutely easy. Does that make sense? And unloading, first falls off easy, second a bit harder, third hard, and fourth extremely hard. Does that make sense? Now, the rate of unloading and loading of hemoglobin defines how much oxygen will be delivered to the cells. And the factors that influence the loading and unloading of hemoglobin are concentration of oxygen, concentration of CO2, blood pH, temperature. Also, biphosphoglycerol is the chemical that's produced during glycolysis. It goes up when the oxygen levels are low, so elevated levels of BPG will promote the delivery of oxygen to the tissues. Okay, we'll get to the factors. What I want to focus your attention on, and it's perhaps the most important concept that we study here, is the hemoglobin dissociation curve. And I'm going to spend some time on it here. So, focus on the purple one. This one, okay? So this is the hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now, what is on the y-axis? The percent of saturation. And what is on the x-axis? That I can tell you. It's the partial pressure of oxygen, basically the oxygen concentration. Now, I'm going to ask you a super tricky question, which has a very simple answer. That's going to be a why question. Why does this curve, 38 degrees Celsius body temperature, why does it look like this? And I have that terrible smirk on my face. The answer is one word. Because what I'm trying to tell you, there is no real reason or something. This is what happens in the human body. This is what I think it's really important to understand this. This was measured. Does that make sense? So scientists measured it and figured out, well, this is how oxygen is transported. Could this curve be a line? Sure, it probably could, but it's not. Basically, can a human have 6 pairs of multifaceted eyes? Maybe, but not in this world. You see what I'm saying? Take this curve and what happens for granted. We're going to talk about implications of this in a second. But this is what is measured, what happens in humans. So, let's take a look at the curve. If anything seems confusing, stop me immediately. Partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury. Where in the body the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury. We just talked about it. Nope. Arterial blood where? Well, where does it start? You're right, it's arterial blood. But where does it get all the oxygen? Come on, which organ? Lungs. Yes. So this is lungs. What is the saturation of hemoglobin in the lungs? Don't look at me. Look at the graph. What's the saturation? That's X. What's the Y for that X on the graph? 100%. That's kind of a duh. Normally, hemoglobin that's in the lungs is 100% saturated. Does that make sense? Good. Let me ask you right away one question. Let's say partial pressure of oxygen decreases. Right about here, so it's say 95. Okay, here. What is the saturation at 95? Not very different, right? So you drop the oxygen concentration, well, kind of a lot. So basically you moved from Ohio to Denver. Saturation didn't decrease much, right? And even if you move farther, like you go all the way hardcore to 80, the saturation will be upper 90s. See? So you can go all the way to, I don't know any other places in Colorado except Denver. So some peak in Colorado. Huh? Aspen. Oh yeah, I know it. I was there. Yeah, I know it. So yeah, it's somewhat harder to breathe. You're not dying, you're not suffocating, your organs work just fine. Does that make sense? Did you notice this? So now we're going to go from the lungs to here, 40 millimeters of mercury. Where is the pressure 40 millimeters? Aaron, you are a pressure expert. No, not in the, well, in the lungs, yes, but where it becomes 40. It was 100 from the lungs all the way down to tissues, and this pressure becomes 40 in the tissues. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? So this partial pressure is in the tissues. That's tissues. What is the hemoglobin saturation at 40? 75. Yeah, 75. So what's the difference in hemoglobin saturation between lungs and tissues? Difference. 25. Now, it's all percentages. Now, 100%, let's take one molecule of hemoglobin, okay, just one. 100% saturation means how many oxygens? 4. 75% saturation means how many oxygens? 3. That one oxygen, where did it go? Yes, tissues. Okay? That molecule of hemoglobin that is shown on the left, after the tissues, where does it go? Simple questions. Back to the lungs. Carrying 3 molecules of oxygen? Yeah. Yeah, but here's the thing. You always think, oh, oxygen is, the hemoglobin is like a truck, okay? Comes in the lungs, get loaded, goes to the tissues, dumps all the oxygen, goes back to the lungs. It turns out you have a truck that has 4 containers full of stuff. Imagine you have a semi-trailer from Walmart It goes all the way from Bentonville, Arkansas. Don't ask me how I know that. The main distribution center is there. But it goes all the way from Bentonville, Arkansas to, I don't know, Cleveland, Ohio. Unloads 1/4, turns around, it goes back to Bentonville. Sounds pretty stupid, right? Turns out it's one of the main protective mechanisms that we have, respiratory mechanisms. So normally, in the normal respiration sort of situation like you are in, or like we now, not exercising, nothing, only 1/4 of all hemoglobin that is carried by the, or 1/4 of oxygen that is carried by hemoglobin is unloaded in the tissues. Does that make sense? And that completely satisfies the tissue requirements. Am I clear? So 3/4, they keep circulating bound to hemoglobin. Does that make sense to you? Why is that important? Well, first, we need to look at the upper part of the curve. So that lady right here is in Aspen. Or even, I don't know, higher. The oxygen concentration decreases. Does that make sense? She's still fine, because despite the oxygen concentration went down quite significantly, hemoglobin saturation didn't drop really. You see what I'm trying to say? Got it? So, now think about this. If this fella on the beach and this lady in the mountains, if they don't do any exercise, just, you know, chilling there, then the partial pressure in the tissues, it's still going to be 40, right? Somewhere here. So the amount of oxygen that reaches the tissues in the lady, it is lower. I'm going to use gender-specific colors. In the lady, it is lower than in that gentleman, right? But it's lower by what, 1%? Maybe 2%? So it's not significant, it's not dramatic. You see what I'm saying? And lady will adapt quickly, you know, erythrocytes and stuff like that. Now, it has actually a very important implication. You know how people, before they dive and swim across the pool, they tend to hyperventilate? You know? I can extend the curve. So if you hyperventilate, if you forcefully increase the amount of oxygen in your lungs, does it increase the saturation? No, it's already at 100%. You cannot go above that, right? So that hyperventilation basically makes no sense. Okay? Now, much more interesting is what happens when you start to exercise. So this lady over here, she's resting. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is 40, and the unloading at 25. You with me? Now this guy swims. His muscles, are they working harder than the muscles of that woman? They are. Meaning they consume more or less oxygen. More. Meaning partial pressure of oxygen in his muscles. Higher or lower? Lower, because the oxygen is consumed. Does that make sense so far? So this is partial pressure of oxygen in the muscles of that gentleman. It's 20. What is the hemoglobin saturation in 20? 40. What's the unloading? 60. So, because of this venous reserve, this guy still is capable to deliver all necessary oxygen to the active tissues without dramatically increasing his respiratory rate. Does it make sense? Just because the unloading in the oxygen-deprived tissues increases. Am I clear? Another question, really important question about this. So you're breathing normally. Now, let's exemplify it using one molecule of hemoglobin, all right? So you have a molecule of hemoglobin named Joe that got 100% saturated in the lungs. So that's Joe. And Joe circulates, and how many? 4 oxygen molecules. That's what Joe carries, right? When Joe gets to the tissues, how many molecules of oxygen it gives away? Just 1. And then returns back to the lungs. We good? Imagine the body where this Joe circulates. This body gets suffocated. Like complete absence of any pulmonary ventilation. No oxygen in the lungs. What's going to end? But tissues, they not dead yet, right? So tissues start using more and more oxygen. What happens to the oxygen partial pressure in the tissues? It'll go down, yeah, it'll decrease. And what will start to happen to Joe's oxygen? It doesn't unload one molecule anymore, right? It will unload more and more as the partial pressure of oxygen in tissues decreases. You see what I'm saying? You always have a huge depot of oxygen bound to hemoglobin. If you basically start to suffocate, you have about 2 minutes worth of oxygen in the blood before your brain starts to die. Does that make sense here? After 2 minutes, you basically run out, literally, of all oxygen. If you do not breathe, you know. That make sense? So this is why that 75% left isn't stupid. That's a protective mechanism. It increases unloading, allows you to have something to unload in case of emergency or exercise. Does that make sense? No. We're going to stop here.